Now, Minister, the reopening of the economy is aimed at kick-starting, basically, Singapore's economy, and we've seen pretty much encouraging signs. We saw growth in exports for the second straight month. I'm just wondering, are those gains sustainable going forward?
So let me make a couple of points. First, I think we have never really stopped the economy. Even during the circuit breaker period, we have about 17% of our people working on site, but we have quite many more people working from home, and that's because of the structure of our economy. So with the resumption of activities on the 2nd of June, we have about 35% of people on site, but essentially more than 3/4 of our economy will be able to resume normal activities. On the numbers that you mentioned, we are quietly encouraged by some of the positive numbers coming in for the first quarter despite the headwinds, but we are not complacent because we are very aware that in the coming months, the downside risks are still many, and we will have to watch the situation and navigate the difficulties very carefully.
There may be downside risks, but is the worst over for Singapore, you think?
I think it's too early to say if the worst is over for the global economy. At this point in time, we are seeing recurring waves, even amongst the countries that have apparently got it under control previously. So the risk of subsequent waves of infection is very high. Second, I think beyond the health crisis, as we suppress the epidemic curve, we now have to suppress the unemployment and the business closure curves. So that's the second set of risks. The third set of risks that we have to manage is what we call the policy-induced risk. And in this, there is the risk that some countries may take on greater protectionist measures, thinking that this will get their economy out of the woods, and that is the wrong thing to do. In fact, we should be looking at greater interdependence for higher resilience rather than independence. And the fourth risk that I think that we have to contend with will be the fact that many countries would need fiscal resources to support their businesses and workers. But not all countries have the fiscal space to do so, and there is a risk that they might use quantitative easing or competitive devaluation to get their economy back in shape. But if they do so, then unfortunately there will be a global knock-on effect. And so these are all the downside risks that I think we have to carefully watch in the coming months.
Having said that, though, Minister, pharmaceuticals have come in really strongly. We're talking about growth in excess of about 16%. Could sectors like pharmaceuticals soften the blow for Singapore? And in view of that, could Singapore see a better than expected Q1 GDP numbers due out next week?
At this point in time, we were fortunate to have a sizable biopharma sector, and this is part of the effort for part of our diversification efforts over the years, so that at any point in time, different sectors of the economy will help us to balance out each other so that we have a more steady growth trajectory. But I think it would be too early to say that just because the biopharma sector is doing well, and perhaps the ICT and banking and finance sectors are relatively unscathed, that overall the economic performance would be lifted because of these few sectors. I think we cannot deny and we cannot underestimate the global demand and supply shocks that we have to contend with.
You talked about working with other countries, Singapore, along with the likes of New Zealand, Australia, South Korea, as well as Canada, are in talks to restart cross-border travel for what's called essential purposes. When can we expect that to happen?
We are working through the processes with Australia and New Zealand, China and Korea at this point in time. We hope to put in place the measures soon. For business travel or for travel in general to resume, we would need a sense of a shared protocols whereby we recognize each other's medical certification and also have the same protocol as to how many days we need to isolate or quarantine the person And is it done in the receiving country or the sending country? So there's quite a bit of details for us to work through. But we hope that once we develop that set of protocols between the like-minded countries and countries generally in the same part of the epidemic control curve, this would be a model that the rest of the other countries and other partners can come on board as well.
Could you define essential services? What does that entail?
You mean essential business travel?
That's right. What does that entail, Minister?
Yes. There are essentially two categories of people that we are looking at. One will be the senior management for many of the multinational companies. The second group of people that we are looking at are the skilled technicians that needs to maintain many of the critical systems around the world.
Minister, at the same time, Mike Pompeo says that the U.S. is working with the likes of India, Vietnam, Australia to restructure supply chains, and that is to reduce the dependence on China. What do you make of that move? And has the U.S. approached China with regards to this?
So I think after this crisis, many countries and many companies will take the issue of supply chain resilience much more seriously than before. Prior to this, I think there are already forces causing the reshape of the global supply chains. This includes the digitalization potential. This includes the geopolitical considerations, the protectionist tendencies of some countries, and also the tax competition across many countries. So the pandemic would be the latest in the suite of factors that will cause the countries and the companies to relook at the resilience of their supply chain. Now, having said that, I don't think this is a zero-sum game. Even if the US or Europe or China or India, for the matter, start to reorganize their supply chains by moving them to some other parts of the world, it actually increases everyone's resilience. At the same time, it also increases the interdependence between the various countries. So let's take an example. If some of the US companies move their operations out from China into Southeast Asia, first of all, it will increase the linkages between Southeast Asia and China. But it doesn't mean that the linkages between the US and the Chinese economy will therefore be entirely decoupled. The next point that we need to note is that even as some of the companies move out of China, and this can include both American and Chinese companies as they seek greater resilience and diversity in their supply base, it will also allow the Chinese economy to have greater capacity to recycle their capital and labor. And in fact, I think China, with or without this pandemic, will certainly be doing that progressively. And all we see is probably the acceleration of this move by the Chinese.
I'm just wondering, has the U.S. approached Singapore with regards to the talks to restructure the supply chain? Is there a sense that perhaps if that were to happen, Singapore could be divided between the two allies, China as well as the U.S.?
I don't think so. At any point in time, I think Singapore plays a role as the intermediary, and we are a free and open economy. We welcome investment from all parties. In fact, we connect the economies from the US to China to Europe and India. So our role is always one of integrating different parts of the global supply chain together. So even as the global supply chain shifts around the region, there are always opportunities for us to continue to play that role well. And perhaps you can even argue that that role is even more important in a world that could potentially be divided by geopolitics and protectionist policies.